He wasn't supposed to be heard. Not like that. Not with that voice. Fluent, crisp, and commanding, in 9 different tongues. The night was unusually quiet. A steady rain tapped against the office windows, like a ticking metronome, syncing with the soft hum of printers left in standby mode. Past midnight, the corridors of the high-rise in downtown Chicago were ghostly, lit only by emergency strips and the occasional flicker from motion sensors. Most had gone home, but not him. He moved slowly, mop in hand, with the deliberate rhythm of someone used to being invisible. A grey jumpsuit, scuffed sneakers, no nameplate. But his lips moved swiftly now, speaking Italian first, then Russian, then Arabic, each word flowing like muscle memory, unseen by all, except one. On the 17th floor, a door had been left ajar. Inside, the CEO leaned back in his chair, a bottle of mineral water in hand, eyes fixed on the financial dashboard glowing from his monitor. But the voice in the hallway pulled him away, not by volume but by texture. He stood quietly, listening. There are sounds that open doors no key ever could. It was after 1 a.m. when Christopher Langley, founder and CEO of Helix Point Solutions, paused his scrolling through the monthly forecast and tilted his head. At first, he thought it was the janitor's radio, some foreign station bouncing through static. But as the sound grew clearer, sharper, and began to shift languages mid-sentence, he realized it wasn't a machine. It was a voice. A man's voice, controlled, articulate, and effortlessly transitioning between French, Portuguese, Mandarin, and back to English. Chris rose from his chair slowly, instinct guiding him more than intent. He walked quietly to the open door of his office suite and peeked out into the dim hallway. There, pushing a mop across the marble tiles, was the janitor, Javier. Javier was in his late 40s, short and square-shouldered, with skin the color of sand and eyes that held stories no one had ever asked to hear. His uniform bore a faded logo, and his badge only read J. Mendez. He wore headphones connected to a small cracked phone tucked into his jumpsuit pocket, speaking softly into a hands-free mic. Chris stood there, still as glass, listening. Javier was discussing something technical, supply chain logistics, timelines, warehouse miscommunications. He switched languages like flipping light switches, correcting someone on the other end with calm authority. Then, just as fluidly, he dropped into Hindi, instructing someone to send confirmation by morning. Javier hadn't noticed him. Chris waited until the call ended. Then he stepped into the light. "Who were you talking to?" Javier froze. The question didn't sound accusatory, just surprised. But his shoulders tensed anyway. He turned, pulling off the headphones. "Just some friends overseas. Nothing work-related, sir." Chris nodded slowly. "How many languages do you speak?" There was a pause. 9, Javier said, quietly, as if that number could bite him. Chris didn't say anything else. He just looked at the man standing before him. Not the mop, not the uniform, not the silence, but the man. Then, with a nod that felt heavier than usual, he walked back into his office and shut the door. The next morning, Chris couldn't stop thinking about it. In all the years he'd built Helix Point, he'd prided himself on hiring top-tier talent, Harvard MBAs, MIT engineers, Silicon Valley veterans. But somehow he'd missed the fact that one of the smartest people in the building had been waxing floors and taking out trash. He asked Marissa, his chief of staff, a question over breakfast in the break room. "Who hired the night janitorial crew?" "Vendor contract," she replied. "External agency. Why?" He didn't answer. That afternoon he walked the halls during a lull between meetings. It wasn't something he normally did, but something about seeing Javier again felt necessary. The man worked like a ghost, efficient, silent, unnoticed. Chris finally caught up with him near the loading dock. "Would you be willing to come in for a chat tomorrow?" he asked, careful to keep his tone casual. Javier looked confused. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Chris replied. "You did something extraordinary." That night, Javier sat in his modest studio apartment in the South Side, staring at the cracked ceiling. The city's sounds filtered through the window, sirens, late-night trains, the occasional bark of a stray dog. On his tiny desk sat an old laptop, flickering with half-written messages and unpaid bills he had spent years hiding. Not from the law or from enemies, but from expectation. From the pain of being seen as something he once was and could no longer afford to be. The languages had been his first love. He grew up in Brazil, son of a polyglot mother and an Angolan father who worked as a dock laborer. He was translating poetry by age 9. By 17, he was tutoring diplomats. At 24, he had a master's degree in applied linguistics from a university in Lisbon. He came to the US with dreams of academic tenure. Then came the visa issues, the rejections, the loss of documentation, the inability to get anything beyond under-the-table jobs. The universities wouldn't look at him without proper papers. And when the pandemic hit, his world shrunk into janitorial shifts and unpaid freelance translation gigs. Now someone had noticed. The wrong person or the right one. He didn't know yet. He looked at his phone. A new message from the agency. CEO has requested a private meeting. Please confirm. Javier closed his eyes. Silence had been his shelter, but now his voice had betrayed him. Javier arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in his best. A button-down shirt that barely held its shape after years of wear, and slacks that had once been part of a church outfit. He sat in the corner of the Helix Point lobby, still clutching his security badge and a manila envelope stuffed with documents that smelled faintly of old paper and eucalyptus. The receptionist, noticing the badge, looked uncertain but said nothing. Chris came down personally to greet him. They took the elevator in silence. Javier watched the digital numbers ascend, each one feeling like a question he hadn't prepared to answer. In the CEO's office, Marissa was already waiting. Her presence added formality that tightened Javier's posture. Chris gestured toward a chair, and Javier sat slowly, balancing the envelope on his knees. "I heard you last night," Chris began, his tone firm but not unkind. "Speaking multiple languages, flawlessly. That's not something you see every day." Javier hesitated, then nodded. "It's just something I never forgot how to do." Chris leaned forward. "Help me understand. Why is someone like you working as a janitor here?" There it was, the question that weighed more than mop buckets, heavier than the years he'd spent trying not to be seen. He opened the envelope and slid it across the table, photocopies of diplomas from the University of São Paulo and the University of Lisbon. Letters of recommendation from old professors, some yellowed with time. Translation certifications in 6 languages, a Portuguese passport, a letter from immigration dated 5 years ago, stamped "Denied." Marissa glanced at the papers, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "I tried," Javier said. "But the moment they saw my visa status, the interview stopped. Even community colleges wouldn't return my calls. I had no work permit for teaching, only for custodial work. So I cleaned and translated online, and kept quiet." Chris sat back, his face unreadable. "We don't usually discuss internal roles with contracted staff," Marissa added cautiously. "But this changes things." Later that day, whispers spread across the office. It began in the HR department, where someone saw the CEO escort a janitor to the 24th floor. Then in IT, where a team member noticed a new external consultant badge being printed. By the time lunch rolled around, theories were swirling. Apparently he speaks like 10 languages. I heard Chris is thinking of firing the communications team. No way. He's probably just writing a book or something. Javier walked through the halls like a man underwater. People turned, stared, smiled awkwardly. Some nodded, a few whispered behind hands. He pretended not to notice, eyes forward, arms tucked close. Chris had offered a temporary role, linguistic strategist, he called it, under the guise of a 60-day trial. It came with access to a desk, a temporary email address, and a flood of onboarding documents. Javier accepted without hesitation, though the title felt hollow in his mouth. He still wore his old shoes. In a private meeting with HR, they asked him about his proficiencies. English, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Arabic, Russian, Mandarin, Hindi, and Swahili, he listed. "How did you learn so many?" "Books, my mother, curiosity. They asked about his history, his immigration status, his employment gaps. He answered with the practiced restraint of someone who knew how much truth to offer before it began to cost him. But there were questions even he couldn't answer, like how to suddenly exist in a space that had never seen him as more than a background noise. In the break room, Kayla, an account manager in her mid-20s, watched him from across the coffee machine. "Do you think he's really that smart?" she asked her colleague Adam, who shrugged. "He mops floors. Can't be that brilliant." But Chris wouldn't bring in someone off the books unless... Their voices trailed off when Javier entered. He walked past them to pour a cup of water, nodding politely. They nodded back, too late. In the weeks that followed, Javier sat in meetings he didn't lead. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, it was always with precision. He translated technical documents that had stalled client relationships for months. He corrected grammar on pitch decks without being asked. Once he called out a mistranslation on a Japanese trade contract before it went to print, saving the company from an international embarrassment. Still, some laughed behind closed doors. "Janitor thinks he's a linguist now," one intern joked, scrolling through Slack. But Chris watched carefully. He saw how Javier kept his head down, how he never corrected anyone in public, how he deflected praise with silence. There was strength there, a quiet, composed brilliance that didn't need spotlight. One day, Chris called him in again. "We have a situation with a potential South African client," he said. "Big deal. We've been emailing for weeks with little traction. Their team speaks primarily Xhosa and English, but our local reps are struggling to connect. I want you in the room." Javier blinked. "Me?" "You," Chris confirmed. "You're not just translating words. You understand tone, nuance, cultural resonance. That's what we need right now." It was the first time in years someone had asked for his voice, not his silence. He nodded. The morning of the client meeting, Javier stood outside conference room 7A, adjusting the sleeves of his borrowed blazer. The building's glass walls reflected his image back to him, a man slightly out of place, both in space and time. He could see the room inside, sleek chrome chairs, a polished table, an LED screen pulsing with a waiting presentation. Already seated were 3 Helix Point executives, including Jenna Hart, the Director of International Strategy, and Kevin Briggs, a sharp-jawed junior VP known for his aggressive climb up the corporate ladder. Javier walked in. Jenna offered a polite smile. Kevin didn't rise. His fingers continued tapping against the table, rhythmic, impatient. "Mr. Mendez," Jenna said. "Thank you for joining us." "We hear you're something of a polyglot," Javier nodded. "I'll do my best to assist." Chris entered last. He took his seat and gave Javier a brief, assuring glance. Then the screen lit up with the incoming video feed. The South African clients appeared, seated in their own conference room. Introductions began in English, but quickly drifted into isiXhosa as the lead negotiator shifted tone. Testing, perhaps, or expressing something not meant for translation. Javier didn't flinch. He responded smoothly in isiXhosa, his tone measured, respectful, warm. The clients paused, visibly impressed. He acknowledged regional inflections, cultural references, and even made a small linguistic joke that landed perfectly. From that moment, the air in the room shifted. The clients relaxed. Their words flowed more naturally. They began explaining what had made the deal stall, a sense of being misunderstood, underestimated, spoken to rather than with. Javier translated both language and feeling, giving breath to meanings that weren't in the words alone. By the end of the hour, they had agreed to a 6-month trial partnership. The call ended with smiles and nods. Chris turned to Javier. "Exceptional." But not everyone in the room looked pleased. Kevin's mouth curled in a near smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Impressive," he said. "I just wonder if we're crossing professional boundaries, letting someone from the janitorial staff into strategic discussions. Raises questions about expertise, doesn't it?" The air chilled. Chris responded calmly. "Expertise isn't defined by title. It's defined by impact. And Javier just helped us close a deal we've been chasing for 4 months." Kevin didn't argue further. But the look in his eyes lingered. Later that day, Javier returned to his makeshift desk in a corner office with no nameplate. He stared at the screen, unread emails multiplying like fruit flies. One was from Jenna, a thank you. Another from a data analyst who had watched the meeting and wanted to learn ICX. But buried among the praise was a forwarded memo, originally sent by Kevin, questioning role clarity and departmental hierarchy. He read it twice, then deleted it. At home that night, Javier sat by the window, the city humming softly outside. He listened to a voicemail in Swahili from his sister in Mozambique. She had heard he might be getting promoted. Finally, she said. They see you. But did they? Or had he simply become useful? He poured tea into a chipped mug, the steam rising in curls. He remembered how language had always been his refuge, how in Lisbon his professors called him a listener of echoes, someone who could hear not just words but histories inside them. Here that gift had become something else, a spectacle, a curiosity. He didn't want applause, he wanted dignity. Back at the office, a shift began. Employees started approaching him hesitantly with language questions. Can you check this phrase for me? How do I say thank you in Bengali? Some came with curiosity, others with condescension masked as admiration. He remained polite, helpful. But he felt it, how quickly people could swing from ignoring you to needing you without ever truly seeing you. One afternoon, Chris invited him for coffee in his office. I've been thinking, Chris began, about formalizing your role, making it permanent. A cross-cultural communications lead, it would mean a real title. Real pay. Javier looked up, the words echoing in a space he had locked for years. I'm honored, he said. But... Chris raised an eyebrow. But? Javier paused. I want to make sure I'm not just being used, that this isn't about novelty. Chris leaned back. It's not. You've added value where we didn't even know we were lacking. But if you feel this isn't right, I respect that. Javier nodded. Let me think about it. That evening he returned to the janitor's closet. He stood at the door a long while before opening it. Inside were his old gloves, a mop bucket, the scent of bleach, the place where he had learned to disappear. He picked up the mop handle, ran his fingers along the worn grip. He closed the door quietly and walked away. It began with a compliment disguised as a jab. At the morning stand-up meeting, Kevin addressed the room. Let's give a quick thanks to our very own janitor/diplomat for sealing the South Africa deal. Javier, you're setting quite the precedent. Maybe we should recruit more linguists from the custodial closet. The room gave an uneasy chuckle. Javier met the comment with a nod, but his eyes didn't smile. Chris remained silent. So did Jenna. But in the days that followed, Kevin's tone became more insistent. He began reviewing Javier's internal communications, flagging them for lack of clarity or overreach. He questioned why a contract worker had access to confidential files, why meetings were being rerouted through Javier's calendar, why someone without managerial training was now advising on international strategy. In private, Chris confronted him. What's your issue? Kevin shrugged. It's not personal, it's about structure. If you start promoting janitors, what message does that send to everyone who worked their way up? Chris responded with steel in his voice. That we value ability over assumption, that we listen when brilliance speaks. Javier tried to stay focused. He continued to support regional teams with translations, cultural coaching, and direct correspondence in over 6 languages. He streamlined communications that had been tangled for months. He never bragged, never demanded recognition, but the subtle currents of resistance began to pull at him. Slack messages slowed. Calendar invites began excluding him. People stopped making eye contact in hallways. Someone anonymously tagged a meme in the company chat, a mop with a graduation cap. Javier closed his laptop and walked to the restroom. He stood at the sink, staring at his reflection under harsh fluorescent light. His blazer, though neatly pressed, still bore the faint wrinkles of past labor. He touched the edge of the sink. The same brand of porcelain he used to scrub. He wondered if people saw him, or just the disruption he represented. Then came the Tokyo deal. A multinational tech partner was on the brink of walking away. Misinterpretations had plagued communications, and the client now demanded face-to-face mediation. Javier was approached by Jenna directly. "We need you on this, Javier." "We're out of time," he hesitated. "Do they know who I am? They know what you can do." The meeting was set. It began as expected. A long conference table, interpreters present but passive. Javier entered, greeted each member of the Japanese delegation in fluent honorific Japanese, his bow precise, his tone understated. He spoke not from a script, but from instinct, weaving context and humility into each sentence. The conversation opened. The negotiation became collaborative. At one point, an executive asked Javier how he had learned their language. "Through listening," he replied, "and through carrying weight most people don't notice." The deal was saved. Back at the office, the story spread quickly. But this time, something changed. A software engineer wrote a company-wide message praising Javier's work. A client submitted a glowing review naming him directly. Employees began to share stories, not of deals closed, but of small interactions. How Javier remembered everyone's name, how he held doors, how he corrected a pronunciation gently, with respect. One afternoon, someone placed a note on his desk, just a yellow sticky, no signature. "You make this place better." But not everyone felt that way. Kevin filed a formal complaint. He claimed Javier had bypassed protocol, operated beyond his scope, and represented a threat to organizational integrity. HR called Javier in. He sat in the windowless conference room, hands folded. "We're required to investigate," the HR rep said. "This doesn't mean anything is wrong, but do you feel you've been treated differently by colleagues?" Javier looked at the ceiling. "I feel seen," he said finally, "and some people don't like what they see." The HR rep hesitated, then nodded. That night, Chris met Javier on the rooftop. The skyline stretched behind them, dark buildings punctured by rectangles of light. "I'm not sure I belong here," Javier admitted. Chris leaned on the railing. "You've done more for this company in 2 months than some have in 2 years." "That's the problem," Javier replied. "For some, that's a threat." Chris turned to him. "What do you want, Javier?" The question hung there, soft but heavy. "To be allowed to contribute," he said, "without becoming a symbol or a scandal." Chris nodded. "You've earned more than a job here," he said. "You've earned respect. But the kind that lasts, that stays quiet and strong, it takes time, and it takes staying." Javier didn't answer right away. He looked out at the city, the thousands of windows, the lives inside them, and decided. It was a Thursday when the internal memo went out. Subject: Open Forum, the language of work. Chris had personally scheduled it, a company-wide gathering with no agenda, no slide deck, no sales numbers. Just one topic: how language shapes culture. The invite was optional, but by noon the main auditorium was standing room only. Curiosity had turned into something deeper. Something that felt like anticipation. Javier sat in the front row at first, unsure whether this was meant to be about him. But when Chris took the podium and gestured for him to join, there was no doubt. He rose slowly, walked to the front. The room fell silent. He looked out at the faces, some kind, some cautious, some unreadable. The same people who had ignored him in elevators. The same ones who now waited for him to speak. He didn't start with credentials, he didn't start with brilliance, he started with cleaning. "I used to wipe down this stage," he said softly, running a hand across the wooden railing. Late at night, when no one was here. A ripple of quiet moved through the room. "I've always loved languages," he continued. "Not just the way they sound, but the way they hold people. Whole histories tucked inside a sentence. A dialect is a lifeline. An accent is a home." He paused. The silence became warmer. "I came to this country believing that if you work hard and stay honest, doors open. But some doors aren't locked, they're just built so quietly you don't even know they exist. So I worked, I cleaned. I listened." He glanced toward the back where a janitor in uniform stood watching. "I never expected to be seen. And when I was... It scared me. Because being seen means being judged. And being judged means being diminished, sometimes, before you even speak." A few people nodded. But then something changed. Someone listened before deciding. He turned toward Chris, who lowered his eyes. That moment taught me something. Respect has no title. It isn't given through roles or resumes. It's given when we choose to listen fully, without waiting to reply. He let the words settle. In every language I speak, there's a word for dignity. But the one I carry with me most comes from my mother's Portuguese, respeito. Not the kind you demand, but the kind you live in silence, waiting for the world to notice. The room was utterly still. Then a hand rose. Jenna. How do we do better? She asked. Javier's voice lowered. By looking past the label, and by remembering that brilliance doesn't always come wrapped in polish. Sometimes it comes with dust on its shoes. In the days that followed, a shift began, not in fanfare but in temperature. People started asking questions differently. Meetings became less about proving, more about connecting. The HR team instituted a quiet initiative to review overlooked resumes from maintenance, food services, and support staff. A new language resource center was launched, with Javier as its inaugural director. It wasn't about translation, it was about teaching people how to hear. Kevin eventually transferred to another branch. No announcement was made, and every morning, before logging in, Javier would stop by the janitor's closet, not out of nostalgia but as a ritual, a silent vow to remember where he had been, and to honor those still unseen. One evening, long after most had gone home, a young intern approached him. Mr. Mendes, I wanted to thank you. You helped me see my father differently. He cleans schools, but he speaks 4 languages. I never thought about what that meant. Javier smiled, something deep behind his eyes. Then I've done my job. The story of Javier Mendes isn't rare. It's just rarely told. For every boardroom shining under fluorescent light, there's a hallway swept in silence. For every resume on the right desk, there are dozens left in drawers, waiting for someone to care. Javier didn't break a system, he illuminated it. Quietly, with fluency not just in language but in dignity. His journey wasn't about talent being discovered, it was about worth being acknowledged regardless of packaging. He didn't climb a ladder. He reminded the building it had more than one floor. Because the truth is, value doesn't knock loudly. Sometimes it waits, mop in hand, until someone listens. The world is full of Javiers. People whose brilliance is buried under uniforms, whose pasts are more complex than we bother to ask. They don't need saving. They need space. They need room to be heard. So if this story stayed with you, let it sit, let it echo. And if you're ready to hear more stories like his, consider staying with us. The next voice might just be someone you've passed by 100 times.